3 days passed in careful equilibrium. Grace grew stronger, her fingers regaining, feeling her color returning. She learned the rhythms of Nathan's solitary life, the early mornings checking traps, the methodical preparation of food, the long silences that felt companionable rather than hostile. She discovered that loneliness and solitude were not the same thing and that a man could be quiet without being cold. On the fourth morning, she woke to find Nathan teaching Samuel how to repair a fence post outside the cabin. Through the window, she watched the way the older man guided the boy's hands, showing him how to brace the wood, where to drive the nails. Patient instruction passed between them, without many words, a language of gesture and demonstration that felt older than speech itself. She made coffee and brought it outside. The men accepted the cups with grateful nods, their breath steaming in the crystalline air. The sun had finally broken through the cloud cover, turning the snow into a field of diamonds. "You're moving better." Nathan observed, his eyes tracking the way she walked without favoring her injured feet. "Thanks to you, both of you, I don't know how I'll ever repay this kindness." "Don't need repaying, just doing what's right." Nathan drove another nail home with 3 precise strikes. Samuel grinned, his young face bright with the pleasure of being included. "Mr. Bradford says a man's character isn't what he does when people are watching. It's what he does when nobody would ever know." "Your foster father is wise," Grace said softly. "He's not my father," Samuel corrected, but there was no sadness in it. "But he's the closest thing I got, and that's plenty." The moment of peace shattered with the sound of hoofbeats. Not 3 riders this time, 6. They came up the trail in a tight formation, snow spraying from beneath their horses' hooves. At their head rode a man Grace recognized even from a distance. Tall, skeletal, thin, wrapped in black. Sheriff Jacob Hayes. And beside him, sitting straight in the saddle like a judge pronouncing sentence, was Father Edmund Blackwood himself. Grace's coffee cup slipped from her fingers, splashing dark liquid across the white snow. Nathan's hand went to her elbow, steadying her. "Get inside. Stay away from the windows. He'll see me anyway, he'll know. He can suspect all he wants. Knowing and proving are different things." Nathan's voice carried the same unshakable certainty it had held when facing Brother Marcus. "Samuel, take her inside, then come back out here with me." The boy obeyed instantly, guiding Grace back into the cabin. But instead of hiding, she positioned herself where she could watch through a gap in the shutters. If this confrontation was about her, she would witness it. The riders stopped in front of the cabin, forming a loose semicircle. Sheriff Hayes dismounted, first his hand resting casually on his gun belt. He was a thick man running to fat with a drooping mustache and eyes that had learned to look past inconvenient truths for the right price. Father Blackwood remained mounted. He sat his horse like a man accustomed to looking down on the world. His pale face was composed in an expression of benevolent concern that made Grace's skin crawl. At 46, he had the ageless quality of people who fed on others, sustained by power rather than food. "Mr. Bradford." The sheriff's voice was professionally neutral, the tone of a man performing a duty he found tedious. "Father Blackwood here has filed a complaint regarding a missing person. I'm obliged to investigate." Nathan stood on his porch, thumbs hooked in his belt, the picture of relaxed vigilance. Samuel flanked him, trying to match the older man's stillness. "Already told Brother Marcus yesterday. No missing persons here. Nevertheless, we'd like to search the premises." Sheriff Hayes pulled a folded paper from his coat. "I have a warrant signed by Judge Thornton." That changed things. Nathan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He held out his hand for the paper, examined it with the careful attention of someone who could read well enough to know when he was being legally trapped. "This warrant's for a search related to stolen monastery property," Nathan said slowly. "It doesn't say anything about missing persons." Father Blackwood spoke for the first time, his voice smooth as oil on water. "Grace Ellen Hartley absconded with certain items belonging to St. Catherine's. A silver crucifix, a leather-bound Bible, various linens and garments. Their return is a matter of church law and civil obligation." "That's a lie," Grace hissed from inside the cabin, though no one outside could hear her. "I took nothing but my own life." Nathan studied the warrant a moment longer, then stepped aside. "Search all you want, but you touch anything that's not listed on this paper, we'll have words." The sheriff nodded to his deputies. They dismounted and began a perfunctory examination of the cabin's exterior, the shed, the small barn where Nathan kept his horse. It was theater and everyone knew it. The real search would come inside. Sheriff Hayes moved toward the door. Nathan let him pass, but when Father Blackwood made to follow, Nathan's arm barred the way. Sheriff and his deputies only. The warrant doesn't give you permission to enter my home. Blackwood's mask slipped for just a fraction of a second, revealing something reptilian beneath. Then it smoothed back into place. As you wish, Mr. Bradford, though I wonder what you have to hide. Same thing any man hides, his privacy. Inside, Grace pressed herself into the corner beside the fireplace, heart hammering. She heard the door open, heard heavy boots on the wooden floor. Sheriff Hayes filled the doorway, his eyes adjusting to the dimmer interior light. His gaze swept the room, taking inventory. One bed recently slept in, 2 coffee cups on the table, a woman's undergarments drying by the fire. He saw her immediately, of course. She made no attempt to hide, standing with her chin raised, wearing one of Nathan's shirts over a borrowed skirt. The sheriff's eyes narrowed, recognition dawned. Miss Hartley, I presume. Mrs. Bradford, actually. The lie came from Nathan, who had followed the sheriff inside. His voice was steady as granite. My wife. Married 5 days ago in Cedar Ridge. Grace's eyes widened, but she had survived 10 years under Father Blackwood's roof by learning when to play along. She moved to stand beside Nathan, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. That's not possible, Sheriff Hayes said, but his tone suggested he was already calculating the implications. Father Blackwood says Miss Hartley was at the monastery 5 nights ago. Father Blackwood is mistaken. Nathan's hand found Grace's, his calloused palm warm against hers. My wife has been here with me all winter. We married quietly, private ceremony. Judge Thornton can confirm it if you ask him. It was a bluff and a dangerous one, but it was also brilliant. Marriage changed everything. A married woman was no longer under church authority, but under her husband's legal protection. Any debt she carried would require the husband's consent to collect. And challenging a marriage certificate meant going through territorial courts, a process that could take months. Sheriff Hayes chewed his mustache, thinking. Finally, he turned and walked back outside. Grace heard him speaking with Father Blackwood in low tones. Then Blackwood's voice rising in anger despite his attempt to maintain clerical composure. That's impossible. She was monastery property until her debt is satisfied. She cannot simply marry her way out of lawful obligation. If they're married, Father, that complicates matters considerably. The sheriff sounded like a man who had just discovered his simple errand had become a legal quagmire. We'd need to challenge the marriage in court, prove it's fraudulent. That takes time. Then we take the time. Blackwood's voice had shed all pretense of gentleness. This was the voice Grace remembered from the cellar, from the locked rooms, from the nights when he reminded her that she was nothing more than property that breathed. Sheriff, I'm filing a formal complaint. Fraud conspiracy to defraud the church. And I want a full investigation into this marriage claim. You can file whatever you want, but I can't arrest people for getting married. Perhaps not, but you can bring them before Judge Thornton to answer questions. And you will. There was a long pause. Grace gripped Nathan's hand tighter, feeling the tremor in her own fingers. They had bought time, perhaps, but the war was far from over. The riders departed, eventually churning back down the trail with the promises of legal action and judicial review. Nathan watched them until they disappeared into the tree line. Only then did he release Grace's hand and step back. I'm sorry, he said. I shouldn't have claimed you as my wife without asking. But it was the only card I had to play. Grace shook her head. You saved me again. But Nathan, they were going to verify the marriage. When they discover it's not real, they'll come back with more than a warrant. Then we make it real. The words hung in the air like frost. Grace stared at him, searching his weathered face for signs of jest or madness. She found neither. You can't be serious. Why not? Nathan moved to the window, his silhouette dark against the bright snow beyond. You need legal protection. Marriage provides it. I've got land, a home, no particular use for either one beyond survival. Seems practical. Marriage isn't supposed to be practical. It's supposed to be about love and companionship, and I had that once. Nathan's voice went rough. Rebecca and Emma, they were everything. I don't expect to have that again. Don't want to, if I'm being honest. The pain of losing them almost killed me. He turned to face her, firelight dancing across his features. But I can offer you safety, legal standing. Roof over your head and food on your table. That's more than you have right now. Grace felt tears burning behind her eyes. The offer was generous, impossibly so, but it was also heartbreaking. This man was offering her shelter while making clear that his heart remained buried on a hillside with his first family. She would be a wife in name, only a legal fiction to thwart Father Blackwood's machinations. And yet, what choice did she have? Return to the monastery and its slow death by servitude. Run to another town with no money and no identity. Face Judge Thornton's court and try to explain 10 years of invisible chains. If I agree, she said slowly, what would you expect from me? Work same as anyone, cooking, mending, helping with the animals. I won't pretend it's an easy life out here. Winters are hard, summers are short, but it's honest work, and you'd be free to do it. And in other ways, her cheeks flushed. Would you expect that? Would this be a real marriage in all respects? Nathan's expression softened slightly. I'm not that kind of man. The bed is yours. I've slept on worse than a floor. If somewhere down the line you felt different, we could talk about it. But there'd be no expectations, no pressure. You'd be safe here. That's the only promise I'm making. Samuel, who had been watching this exchange with wide eyes, suddenly spoke up. Mr. Bradford, if you marry Miss Grace, does that make her my foster mother? Despite everything, Grace laughed. It was a small sound and almost foreign in her own throat, but genuine. I suppose it might. Good. The boy nodded solemnly. You make better coffee than Mr. Bradford, and you don't burn the biscuits. The moment of levity broke some of the tension. Nathan allowed himself a slight smile. The boy makes a fair point about the biscuits. Grace took a deep breath. She thought about Father Blackwood's face, about 10 years of locked doors and controlled portions, and nights spent wondering if she would live to see 30. She thought about Sister Sarah lying broken at the bottom of a cliff, and she thought about this quiet man who had carried her out of the snow, who had faced down armed men to protect her, who was offering her a life without demanding her soul in return. All right, she said. Yes, I'll marry you. Nathan nodded once, a minimal gesture that somehow felt binding as any vow. We'll need to go to Cedar Ridge, file the paperwork properly, get it registered before Blackwood can challenge it. Tomorrow, road should be clear enough. Doc Sullivan can come with us as a witness in Samuel. He glanced at the boy. You up for a ride to town? Samuel's face split in a grin. Yes, sir. I'll get the horses ready at dawn. That night, Grace lay awake long after the fire burned low. In 2 days, she had gone from dying in the snow to preparing for marriage. The whiplash of it all made her head spin. This was not how she had imagined her life unfolding. When she was young, before her father's death, she had dreamed of love and romance like any girl. A courtship, a proposal on bended knee, a wedding with flowers and music and joy. Instead, she would have a transaction, practical, necessary, loveless, but not unkind. It should have felt like another form of servitude, another contract signed under duress. But somehow it did not. Nathan was giving her something Father Blackwood never had. A choice, the power to say yes or no, and the freedom to walk away if she wished. She heard him moving in the darkness, settling onto his bedroll on the floor, his breathing steadying into the rhythm of sleep. Outside, night wind whistled through the pines. An owl called somewhere in the distance. The world continued its ancient patterns, indifferent to human complications. Grace closed her eyes and tried to imagine a future. A year from now, 5 years, would she still be here on this mountain, living beside a man who spoke in spare sentences and carried ghosts in his eyes? Would she learn to love this harsh landscape, this life of simplicity and survival? Would she ever feel like more than a refugee taking shelter from the storm? She did not know. But for the first time in a decade, she had the luxury of not knowing. The luxury of a future that was not already written in contract terms and debt ledgers. Whatever came next would be uncertain, difficult, probably uncomfortable. But it would be hers. That was worth more than all the silver crucifixes in all the monasteries in Montana Territory. The journey to Cedar Ridge began before dawn. Nathan hitched his 2 Morgan horses to a sled, the only practical way to travel through snow that still lay waist-deep in places. He packed blankets, a rifle dried meat, and a lantern filled with oil. Doc Margaret arrived as promised, her weathered face set with determination. You're sure about this? She asked Nathan as they prepared to leave. Marriage isn't something you undo with a handshake. I'm sure. Margaret studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Rebecca would have approved. She always said you had too much heart to waste it on loneliness. The name hung in the cold air between them. Nathan's jaw tightened, but he did not look away. Rebecca's gone. This is about keeping someone alive who's still breathing. Grace emerged from the cabin wearing her borrowed clothes and Nathan's heavy coat. Her hair washed and braided, caught the first rays of sunlight. She looked fragile still, her cheeks hollow from years of sparse rations, but there was steel in her spine that had not been there 5 days ago. Samuel helped her onto the sled, arranging blankets around her legs. "You look nice, Miss Grace." "Like a real bride." She managed to smile. "Thank you, Samuel, though I suspect most brides have better dresses than this. My mom always said it's not the dress that makes the wedding, it's the promises." The boys' simple wisdom settled over them like snow. They set off the sled runners, hissing across the frozen landscape, the horses' breath steaming in plumes. The journey that normally took 3 hours stretched to 6. The snow had settled but not melted, creating a world of blinding whiteness, broken only by the dark spears of pine trees. Nathan drove with his usual quiet competence, reading the land like a man born to it. He avoided the deeper drifts, found paths where the wind had scoured the snow. Thin stopped twice to rest the horses. Doc Margaret rode alongside on her own mount, keeping pace. Samuel sat in back with Grace pointing out landmarks and chattering to fill the silence. "That's Widow's Peak, where Mr. Bradford shot the grizzly that was raiding farms. And there's Blackwater Creek, frozen solid now, but full of trout come spring. And see that stand of aspens." He trailed off suddenly, aware of what he had been about to say, where Mr. Bradford's family was buried. "It's all right," Grace said softly. "You can talk about them. They were real people who lived and mattered. Pretending they didn't exist would be worse than remembering they did." Samuel looked at her with something like reverence. "You're kind, Miss Grace. Kinder than most people." "I've had unkindness enough for several lifetimes. I prefer to practice something different." They reached Cedar Ridge as the sun climbed to its winter apex, pale and cold. The town was small, barely 300 souls, a collection of wooden buildings clustered around a main street that served as both commercial hub and social center. The saloon stood at one end, the church at the other, as if the town could not decide which better represented its character. Nathan drove straight to the modest home of Judge William Thornton, a weathered structure distinguished by its second story and glass windows. The judge himself answered the door, a man of 68, with a white beard that rivaled Nathan's for length, and a pair of spectacles that magnified his shrewd eyes. "Nathan Bradford." The judge's voice carried surprise and curiosity in equal measure. "I haven't seen you in what, 10 years? Well, 14, sir, not since the funerals. And now you appear at my door with a woman, a boy, and Doc Sullivan. This must be quite the story." "It's a wedding, Judge, and I need it done legal and quick." Thornton's eyebrows rose. "A wedding? Well then, come inside before you freeze. Though I should warn you, marriage is one of those things that's easier to get into than out of." The judge's parlor was warm and cluttered with books. A fire crackled in the hearth. Thornton's wife, a plump woman with kind eyes, brought coffee and disappeared with a knowing smile. The judge settled behind his desk and folded his hands. "Now then, who are the parties to this union?" "Nathan Bradford and Grace Ellen Hartley. We want it done proper, licensed and registered." The judge's pen scratched across paper. "Miss Hartley, are you entering this marriage of your own free will?" Grace met his eyes steadily. "I am." "No one is coercing you, no debts or obligations forcing your hand." She thought of Father Blackwood of 10 years in chains masquerading as charity. But she also thought of Nathan standing on his porch with a shotgun of the choice he had offered, without demands attached. "No one is forcing me. This is my decision." Thornton studied her face, reading whatever truth lived there. Finally, he nodded and turned to Nathan. "And you, sir, you understand that marriage is a lifelong covenant, that you're accepting responsibility for this woman's welfare debts and legal standing." "I understand. Because if there are existing claims against Miss Hartley, those claims become your burden. Creditors can pursue you for her debts. Her obligations become yours. Do you accept this knowingly?" Nathan's voice did not waver. "I accept it." The judge made several more notations, then looked up. "The fee is $2. Do you have witnesses?" Doc Margaret stepped forward. "I'll witness." "And I will too," Samuel added, puffing up with the importance of the moment. Thornton smiled. The law requires witnesses over 18, son, but I appreciate the enthusiasm. He glanced at his wife, who had reappeared in the doorway. Martha, would you serve as second witness? Gladly. The ceremony itself was brief, almost perfunctory. They stood before the fireplace, the judge reading from a worn book, his voice lending gravity to words that had bound countless lives together. Grace found herself focusing on small details. The way firelight caught in Nathan's beard, the calluses on his hands as he took hers, the steady rhythm of his breathing. Nathan Bradford, do you take Grace Ellen Hartley to be your lawfully wedded wife in plenty and in want, in sickness and in health, until death parts you? I do. Grace Ellen Hartley, do you take Nathan Bradford to be your lawfully wedded husband in plenty and in want, in sickness and in health, until death parts you? She thought about the alternative, thought about Father Blackwood's cold eyes and Brother Marcus's nervous hands, and Sister Sarah's broken body at the cliff bottom, thought about 10 more years of servitude stretching into darkness. And she thought about the man beside her, damaged and distant, but offering her something precious: freedom, choice, safety. I do. By the authority vested in me by Montana Territory, I pronounce you husband and wife. The marriage is legal and binding. There was no kiss. Nathan simply squeezed her hand, once gently, a gesture that felt like reassurance rather than romance. Grace squeezed back. It was enough. Judge Thornton prepared the marriage certificate with meticulous care, his pen forming elegant letters. December 26, 1887. Nathan of Bradford and Grace Ellen Bradford. Witnessed and sealed. He pressed his official stamp into warm wax, making it official, making it real. Congratulations to you both, he said, handing Nathan the document. I'll file a copy with the Territorial Registry. You keep this safe. Nathan folded the paper carefully and tucked it inside his coat. Thank you, Judge. One more thing. Thornton's expression grew serious. I should tell you, Sheriff Hayes was here 2 days ago. He asked about you, Nathan, about whether I'd performed any recent marriages. I told him I don't discuss private business without cause, but he seemed quite interested. Father Blackwood put him up to it, Grace said quietly. The judge's eyes sharpened. The monastery, what's their interest in your marriage? Grace opened her mouth to explain, but Nathan spoke first. They claim my wife owes them a debt, a work contract signed when she was underage. We believe the contract is invalid, but they're pushing back. The judge leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. A contract signed by a minor without parental consent is generally unenforceable. But church contracts can be tricky. They often claim canon law supersedes civil law. How much is the supposed debt? $400. Thornton whistled low. That's substantial, more than most ranch hands make in 2 years. He fixed Grace with a penetrating look. Did you receive any wages during your time at the monastery? No, Father Blackwood said my labor was paying down the debt my father owed, but the amount never seemed to decrease. That's called debt bondage, and it's illegal under territorial law. However, proving it requires evidence, documents, witnesses, a trial. Are you prepared for that kind of fight? We are, Nathan said simply. Thornton studied them both for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I like your spine, Nathan Bradford. Always did. You come back if you need legal counsel. I may be old, but I still remember how to fight. They left the judge's home as the afternoon sun began its descent. Grace felt strange, disoriented by the speed at which her life had changed. 5 days ago, she had been Sister Grace property of St. Catherine's, counting steps in the snow toward death. Now she was Mrs. Grace Bradford, a married woman with legal standing and a name that belonged to her. We should get back before dark, Doc Margaret said, checking the sky. Another storm's coming, I can smell it. But Samuel, who had been unnaturally quiet since the ceremony, suddenly spoke up. Mr. Bradford, there's riders coming. They all turned. 6 men on horseback were approaching down the main street, and even from a distance, Grace recognized the lead figure. Sheriff Jacob Hayes, moving with the deliberate pace of a man on official business. And riding beside him, black cloak billowing like crow wings, was Father Edmund Blackwood. Nathan's hand moved instinctively to his gun belt, then stopped. They were in town now, surrounded by witnesses. Violence here would mean arrest, trial, prison. He had to play this differently. The riders stopped 10 feet away. Sheriff Hayes dismounted, his face professionally neutral, but his eyes uncomfortable. Mr. Bradford, Mrs. Bradford, Father Blackwood has filed a formal complaint regarding the validity of your marriage. On what grounds? Nathan's voice was level. Father Blackwood remained mounted, looking down at them with an expression of sorrowful disappointment that made Grace's stomach turn. The grounds, Mr. Bradford, are fraud. Grace Ellen Hartley entered into a binding contract with St. Catherine's Monastery. That contract stipulates she owes 10 years of service, of which she has completed tenure, but accumulated $400 in additional debts for room board and spiritual instruction. She cannot marry without monastery approval until her obligations are satisfied. That's not how the law works, Doc Margaret interjected. A woman can marry who she chooses, not when she's already committed to the church. Blackwood's voice remained smooth but steel glinted beneath the silk. Canon law is clear. Her vows to St. Catherine's take precedence. She never took vows, Nathan said. She's not a nun. She's a woman who was forced into labor as a child. Blackwood's expression shifted to wounded innocence. Forced Grace came to us voluntarily after her father's tragic death. We offered her shelter, food, education, spiritual guidance. All we asked in return was honest work. Is that force, Sheriff? Hayes shifted uncomfortably. The law is complicated here, folks. If there's a pre-existing contract and if Mrs. Bradford signed it, then her marriage might be considered contracted under false pretenses. The husband should have been informed of her debts before the ceremony. I was informed, Nathan lied smoothly, and I accepted them. Then you accept responsibility for the $400 debt. Blackwood leaned forward in his saddle, eyes glittering. The trap closed around them. If Nathan said yes, he would be legally obligated to pay a sum he did not have. If he said no, the marriage could be challenged as fraudulent. Either way, Father Blackwood won. But before Nathan could answer, Judge Thornton's voice cut through the cold air. The old man had followed them outside, wrapped in a heavy coat, his wife beside him. Sheriff Hayes, what's the meaning of this harassment? Thornton's tone carried the authority of decades on the bench. I just performed this marriage ceremony. The license is filed and legal. If Father Blackwood has complaints, he can file them through proper channels and wait for a court date like anyone else. That's what I'm trying to arrange, Judge. Hayes looked relieved to have the judge intervene. Father Blackwood wants a hearing to determine the validity of the marriage and the enforceability of the monastery's contract. Fine, then we'll have a hearing. January 8th, my courtroom, 9 in the morning. Both parties can present evidence and witnesses. Until then, this marriage stands as legal and valid. Are we clear? Blackwood's mask slipped on for just a second, revealing the fury beneath. But he recovered quickly, inclining his head in a gesture of false respect. Of course, Your Honor. We simply seek justice. Justice delayed is justice denied, Father. But justice rushed is justice corrupted. We'll do this properly or not at all. The priest gathered his reins. As he turned his horse, he looked directly at Grace. You cannot run from God's will, my child, nor from your obligations. I will see you in court. The threat hung in the air long after the riders departed. Grace felt herself trembling, despite the coat wrapped around her shoulders. Nathan's hand found the small of her back, a gesture of support that steadied her. Thank you, Judge, he said quietly. Don't thank me yet. You've bought yourself 2 weeks. Use them wisely. Find evidence. Gather witnesses. Build your case, because I'll tell you straight, Nathan. Church contracts are hard to break, and Father Blackwood didn't get to where he is by playing fair. They made the journey back to Thunder Ridge in heavy silence. The threatened storm held off just long enough for them to reach the cabin. That night, Grace sat by the fire wearing a simple ring that Nathan had carved from a piece of antler. It was rough, unpolished, but it fit her finger perfectly. Nathan sat nearby, cleaning his rifle with methodical care. Finally, he spoke. I'm sorry this isn't the wedding you deserved. Grace looked at the ring, then at him. It's exactly the wedding I needed, and that's worth more than any fairy tale. Outside, the first flakes of new snow began to fall. They had 13 days until the hearing. 13 days to find a way to break chains forged from ink and enforced by a man who believed himself beyond judgment. 13 days to prove that freedom was not a sin and that salvation could come from the most unexpected sources. The days between the wedding and the hearing passed with the urgency of a ticking clock. Nathan knew they needed more than righteous indignation to win in Judge Thornton's courtroom. They needed evidence, witnesses' proof that Father Blackwood's contract was not charity, but chains dressed in pious language. On the second day of their marriage, Doc Margaret returned with news. She sat at Nathan's table, her weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, her expression grave. "I made inquiries," she said carefully, discreetly about St. Catherine's and the girls who've passed through there. "Most people won't talk. They're afraid of crossing the church, but I found someone who might help." "Who?" Grace leaned forward, hope kindling in her chest. "Widow Martha Brennan lives about 10 miles west of here. Her granddaughter Kate was at St. Catherine's 5 years ago. She escaped, made it to Portland, married a shopkeeper. Martha says Kate might be willing to testify, but getting her back here in time for the hearing would be impossible. The journey takes 2 weeks in good weather." "Could she write a statement?" Nathan asked. "She could, but Father Blackwood's lawyers will argue that written testimony is hearsay, inadmissible, without the witness present to be cross-examined." Margaret paused. "However, Martha herself might testify about what Kate told her. It's secondhand, but it's better than nothing." "We'll take it." Nathan stood reaching for his coat. "Can you take us to her?" They rode out that afternoon. Grace seated behind Nathan on his horse, her arms wrapped around his waist for balance. The intimacy of the position should have felt awkward given the nature of their arrangement, but instead it felt practical necessary. Survival in Montana meant setting aside Eastern notions of propriety. Widow Brennan's cabin was smaller than Nathan's, nestled in a hollow protected from the worst winds. Martha herself was a woman of 67, bent by arthritis, but sharp-eyed and sharp-tongued. She invited them in without ceremony, offered them elk stew without asking if they were hungry, and listened to their story without interruption. When Grace finished speaking, Martha set down her spoon with deliberate care. "My Kate was 15 when Father Blackwood took her in," she said, her voice hardening with each word. "Her parents died of cholera, left her with nothing. He promised her shelter, education, a chance at a decent life. What she got was 12-hour days scrubbing floors, mending clothes for wealthy church patrons, serving meals she wasn't allowed to eat until everyone else had finished." Martha's eyes grew distant, remembering. "She tried to leave after a year. He locked her in the cellar for 3 days. No food, no water. When she still insisted on going, he showed her the contract she'd signed. Told her she owed $500 for room and board. Told her if she left, he'd have the sheriff hunt her down as a thief." "How did she escape?" Grace asked softly. "Waited until winter, same as you. Walked 18 miles through snow to reach a distant cousin in Helena. Married the first decent man who'd have her, and moved far enough away that Blackwood couldn't reach her." Martha fixed Grace with a knowing look. "You're the first one who's tried to fight back instead of just run. That takes spine. I'm not fighting alone." Grace glanced at Nathan, who sat quietly listening, his presence solid as the mountains outside. Martha studied them both, then nodded slowly. "I'll testify. I'll tell the judge what Kate told me. But you need more than one old woman's secondhand story. You need proof that Father Blackwood is not the saint he pretends to be." "What kind of proof?" Nathan asked. Martha's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "The kind buried on monastery grounds." The room went silent, except for the crackle of the fire. Grace felt ice spreading through her veins. She had suspected, of course, but hearing it confirmed made the horror real. "You're saying Father Blackwood killed her," Nathan said. "It was not a question." "I'm saying someone did. And whoever it was, they're still walking free while that poor girl rots in unhallowed ground. Mary told me about Sister Sarah Fletcher. Said the girl tried to escape 2 years back. They found her dead at the bottom of Raven's Cliff. Called it an accident, but Kate saw bruises on Sarah's neck before they buried her. Hand-shaped bruises." Grace's hand went to her throat. "I saw them too, before the burial. They let me see her body to remind me what happens if I try to leave." Nathan and Grace exchanged a long look. What Martha was suggesting was dangerous, possibly illegal, certainly horrifying. But it might also be the only way to expose the truth. "Where is she buried?" Nathan asked. "Small cemetery behind the monastery. Maybe 20 graves total. Sarah's in the northeast corner, away from the others. Like they were ashamed of her even in death." That night, Nathan and Samuel made preparations. They gathered shovels, lanterns, heavy coats, and rope. Grace watched them work, her stomach churning with equal parts hope and dread. I'm coming with you, she said. Nathan shook his head. Too dangerous. If we're caught, I can claim I was hunting nearby and saw something suspicious. You can't. You're already on Father Blackwood's list. She's right, though, Samuel interjected quietly. If you find Sister Sarah, if she was her the way we think Miss Grace knew her, she can identify her. That makes the evidence stronger. Nathan looked at the boy, surprised by the reasoning. Then he looked at Grace, seeing the determination in her face. Finally, he nodded. All right, but you stay close. Do exactly as I say, and if anything goes wrong, you run. Don't argue, don't hesitate. Just run. They set out at midnight on New Year's Eve when they knew the monastery would be holding a special vigil service. The cemetery would be deserted, the monks occupied with prayer and ritual. The timing was deliberate, calculated, desperate. The ride took 90 minutes through darkness, broken only by starlight reflecting off snow. They left the horses a quarter-mile from the monastery and approached on foot, moving slowly, carefully aware that sound carried far in the frozen air. The cemetery was exactly where Martha had described it. A small plot enclosed by a low stone wall. Wooden crosses marked most of the graves, with only a few stone markers for those wealthy enough to afford them. In the northeast corner, almost hidden behind a larger monument, stood a simple cross with words carved crude and hasty. Sister Sarah Fletcher, 1863 to 1885. Nathan handed Grace a lantern. Keep it shuttered unless I say otherwise. Samuel, you watch the path. Whistle like a hawk if anyone comes. The boy nodded and disappeared into the shadows. Nathan began to dig. The ground was frozen hard as iron, resistant to the shovel's bite. Each strike rang with a dull thud that seemed impossibly loud despite Nathan's attempts at stealth. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the bitter cold. Grace held the lantern steady, her breath forming clouds in the darkness. It took 2 hours to dig down 3 feet. Then the shovel hit something that was not frozen earth. Wood. Nathan cleared snow and dirt from around it, with his hands revealing a pine box, cheap and already rotting at the corners. The kind of coffin given to those deemed unworthy of better. Open it, Grace whispered. Nathan hesitated. You sure you want to see this? I need to see it. For Sarah. For all of us. He used the shovel to pry the lid loose. The nails gave with squeals of protest, and on. The lid lifted, and lantern light spilled into the grave. Sister Sarah Fletcher lay as she had been placed 2 years ago. Her body preserved by cold and the chemicals of decomposition. Her habit had faded to gray. Her skin had drawn tight against her bones. But the evidence Martha had spoken of was there, clear as a confession written in flesh. Her neck bore marks, not the clean break of a fall, but the mottled bruising of hands that had squeezed until life fled. And worse, at the back of her skull, visible where the coffin had shifted, was a depression in the bone. A fracture, the kind made by a heavy object striking from above. Grace made a sound, half sob, half gasp. Nathan steadied her with one hand while shielding the lantern with the other. She didn't fall, Grace whispered. Someone hit her from behind, then strangled her, then pushed her off the cliff to hide what they'd done. We need Doc Margaret to examine this, Nathan said. She can write a medical report, testify to the injuries. But that means bringing the body back with us. Can you handle that? Grace thought of Sarah's kindness, her quiet rebellion, her whispered dreams of freedom. She thought of how this woman had been murdered for wanting what every person deserved, the right to choose their own life. And she thought of how many other women might suffer the same fate if Father Blackwood was not stopped. We're taking her, Grace said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. We're bringing her home. They wrapped Sarah's remains in canvas and secured the bundle with rope. Nathan lifted it with reverent care, as if carrying something precious rather than evidence of murder. They had just finished refilling the grave when Samuel's hawk whistle split the night. Someone was coming. Nathan moved fast, pulling Grace behind a large monument while Samuel scrambled to join them. Through the darkness, they saw a lantern light approaching. 2 figures, one tall and thin, one shorter and nervous. As they drew closer, voices became audible. The nervous voice belonged to a young monk Grace recognized. Brother Timothy, barely 20, new to the monastery. I don't like this, Brother Marcus. Timothy's voice shook. I don't care what you like. Brother Marcus's voice was tight with stress. Father Blackwood wants the cemetery checked every night until after the hearing. He's convinced someone will try to dig up evidence. But Brother Marcus, what if they're right? What if Sister Sarah really was murdered? Then you keep your mouth shut, boy, unless you want to end up beside her. The threat hung in the cold air. Timothy fell silent. They walked the perimeter of the cemetery, their lantern casting long shadows across the snow. For one terrible moment, Marcus's light fell on the freshly disturbed grave on the slight depression where Nathan's shovel had compacted the earth. Grace held her breath. Nathan's hand moved to the knife at his belt, though she knew he would only use it as a last resort. Violence now would ruin everything. But Marcus, nervous and distracted, failed to notice the disturbance. He completed his circuit and turned back toward the monastery, Timothy trailing behind him, like a reluctant shadow. They waited 30 minutes after the lights disappeared before moving. The journey back was nightmare slow, hampered by the weight of their burden and the constant fear of discovery. Dawn was breaking when they finally reached Doc Margaret's cabin. The doctor took one look at the canvas-wrapped bundle and nodded grimly. "Bring her inside, and pray we can prove what killed her before Father Blackwood finds out what you've done." The examination took most of the day. Margaret worked with meticulous care, documenting every injury, every fracture, every piece of evidence that Sarah's death was no accident. Grace assisted, her hands steady despite the horror of it all. She owed Sarah this much: the truth, the acknowledgement of her murder. When Margaret finished, she sat back and removed her spectacles, wiping them with shaking hands. Blunt force trauma to the occipital region, consistent with being struck from behind by a heavy object. Manual strangulation evidenced by damage to the hyoid bone and residual bruising on the soft tissue of the neck. Multiple fractures consistent with a fall from significant height, but sustained post-mortem after death had already occurred. She looked at Nathan and Grace. This woman was murdered. Then her body was staged to look like an accidental fall. I'll stake my medical license on that conclusion. "Will Judge Thornton accept your testimony?" Nathan asked. "He will if I present it properly. But we need more than my medical opinion. We need someone who witnessed Father Blackwood's violence, someone who can place him at the scene." "Brother Marcus," Grace said suddenly. "He was there the night I escaped. He's terrified of Father Blackwood. And tonight I heard him threaten Brother Timothy. He said you'll end up beside her when talking about Sister Sarah. He knows what happened." "Knowing and testifying are different things," Margaret cautioned. "If Marcus is complicit in the murder, he won't incriminate himself. Unless he's more afraid of prison than he is of Father Blackwood." Nathan stood, his decision made. "I'm going to visit Brother Marcus tonight. Alone. Sometimes a private conversation can accomplish what a courtroom cannot." Grace wanted to protest, but she saw the determination in his eyes and understood. Some battles required a man to stand alone. Some confrontations could not include witnesses. That night, while Grace and Samuel waited at Doc Margaret's cabin, Nathan rode to the small house where Brother Marcus lived on monastery grounds. He knocked once, waited, then knocked again. Marcus opened the door, his face draining of color when he saw who stood on his threshold. "Mr. Bradford, it's late. I know we need to talk about Sister Sarah, about what really happened 2 years ago, and about whether you want to spend the rest of your life lying for a murderer." Marcus's hand trembled on the doorframe. For a long moment he seemed frozen between fear and conscience. Then slowly he stepped aside. "Come in," he whispered, but quietly. "The walls have ears, and Father Blackwood has eyes everywhere." What passed between them in that small room would remain private, known only to the two men who stood facing each other in the lamplight. But when Nathan emerged 2 hours later, Marcus stood at the window watching him go, tears streaming down his face. A decision made that would change everything. 3 days until the hearing. They had evidence. They had witnesses. They had the truth, cold and brutal and undeniable. Now they needed only to survive long enough to speak it in a courtroom where justice might, if they were fortunate, prove stronger than power. The days that followed were spent in careful preparation. Judge Thornton came to the cabin to take Grace's formal statement, documenting every detail of her 10 years at the monastery. The conditions, the work, the locked doors, the accumulating debt that never seemed to shrink, no matter how hard she labored. "This is powerful testimony," Thornton said when she finished. "But Blackwood's lawyers will attack your credibility. They'll call you disgruntled, vengeful, a liar. We need corroboration." "We have it," Nathan said. He explained about Sarah's body, about Doc Margaret's examination, about the conversation with Marcus. Thornton's expression grew grave. If Marcus testifies, if he admits to helping cover up a murder, that changes everything. But you understand he could recant at the last moment. Fear is a powerful motivator, and Blackwood knows how to inspire it. He'll come, Nathan said, though his voice held less certainty than his words. Word spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire. The trial had become the talk of the territory. A woman fighting the church, a mountain man defending her, allegations of murder and slavery dressed in holy robes. The kind of spectacle that drew crowds hungry for drama. Thomas Garrett, who owned the general store, stopped by the cabin on January 5th. About half the town's behind you, he said. The other half thinks you're troublemakers attacking a sacred institution. But everyone will be at the courthouse. This is the biggest thing to happen in Cedar Ridge in years. Meanwhile, Father Blackwood was not idle. He hired expensive lawyers from Helena, men known for defending wealthy clients against seemingly insurmountable odds. He began a campaign of whispers and rumors. Grace Hartley was mentally unstable. Nathan Bradford was a dangerous hermit with a grudge against civilization. This was not about justice, but about vendetta. The night before the trial, Grace sat by the fire, unable to sleep. Nathan found her there at 3 a.m, staring into the flames. What if it doesn't work? She asked quietly. What if the judge believes him? Then we appeal. We keep fighting. Nathan sat beside her. But it will work. Truth has power. And we've got truth on our side. Plus, Doc Margaret's scary when she's mad, Samuel added from his bedroll, surprising them both. They had thought he was asleep. Nobody wants to cross her. Despite everything, they laughed, the tension breaking for just a moment. Nathan reached over and took Grace's hand. It was not a romantic gesture, not precisely. It was the grip of a partner, an ally, someone who had chosen to stand with her when everyone else had looked away. Whatever happens tomorrow, he said, you're not going back there. I promise you that. Even if we have to run, even if we have to leave Montana Territory entirely, you're not going back. Grace squeezed his hand in return. I know, and Nathan, I want you to know this marriage. It started as a strategy, a legal maneuver. But these past 2 weeks living here, working beside you, watching the way you treat people with respect and dignity, I've come to care for you. More than I thought possible. Nathan was quiet for a long moment. Rebecca was my whole world. When she died, I thought that part of me died too. But you're right, something's changed. I'm not sure what to call it yet. But it's real. They sat together in silence, watching the fire burn low. Outside, the last night before the trial passed into history. Tomorrow would bring judgment one way or another. Tomorrow would determine whether freedom was something you could fight for and win, or whether power always triumphed over justice. But tonight they had each other, and for now that was enough. January 8th, 1888. Dawn broke cold and clear over Cedar Ridge. The courthouse doors opened at 8:30, and by 8:45 every seat was filled. People stood 3 deep at the back of the room. The entire town had turned out, along with ranchers and miners from 50 miles in every direction. This was not just a trial. This was a reckoning. Grace sat at the defendant's table beside Nathan, wearing a simple dress that Doc Margaret had altered to fit her. Her hands were folded in her lap, steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. Across the aisle, Father Edmund Blackwood sat ramrod straight, flanked by 2 lawyers in expensive suits, whose expressions radiated practiced superiority. Judge Thornton had recused himself, citing conflict of interest. In his place sat Judge Harrison McCall, a retired federal judge brought in from Helena. At 65, McCall had a reputation for fairness and an absolute intolerance for courtroom theatrics. He entered through the chamber door, and the bailiff called the room to order. This hearing concerns the validity of a marriage contract and the enforceability of a prior work agreement. McCall said, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed courtroom. We're here to determine facts, not to stage entertainment. Anyone who disrupts these proceedings will be removed. Counselors, make your opening statements brief. We have considerable evidence to review. The church's lawyer, a man named Garrison with silver hair and a voice like honey over gravel, stood first. Your Honor, the facts are simple. Grace Hartley signed a binding contract with St. Catherine's Monastery in 1877. She agreed to 10 years of service in exchange for the monastery, assuming her father's debt of $800. She completed that service but accumulated additional costs totaling $400. Rather than honor her obligations, she fled in the night and fraudulently married Mr. Bradford to escape legal responsibility. We asked this court to nullify the marriage and order Mrs. Bradford return to the monastery to complete her service. The words hung in the air like poison. Grace felt dozens of eyes on her, judging, assessing, wondering if she was the ungrateful wretch this lawyer portrayed. But Nathan's hand found hers beneath the table, warm and steady. Nathan stood unfolding to his full height. He looked profoundly uncomfortable in his suit coat, but when he spoke, his voice carried the same bedrock certainty it always did. Your Honor, the contract Mr. Garrison describes was signed by a 17-year-old girl who had just buried her father and had nowhere else to turn. She was told it was charity. She was told she was being saved. What she got was 10 years of unpaid labor, physical abuse, and imprisonment. The monastery calls this service. Montana law calls it slavery. And as for the marriage, my wife entered it freely of her own will with full knowledge of her situation. There's nothing fraudulent about it. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge McCall gavelled for silence. The church's case proceeded with mechanical efficiency. They produced the contract bearing Grace's signature in the uncertain hand of a frightened teenager. They called character witnesses who testified to Father Blackwood's charitable works. They presented ledgers showing costs incurred by Grace's presence, all meticulously recorded and totaling exactly $400. It was damning in its thoroughness. Grace watched the faces of the townspeople and saw doubt creeping into sympathetic expressions. The law was on Blackwood's side. Numbers and signatures did not lie, even if the circumstances that produced them did. Then came the turning point. Your Honor, Nathan stood. I'd like to call Widow Martha Brennan. Martha took the stand with the dignity of someone who had lived too long to fear powerful men. She placed her weathered hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. When Nathan asked her to recount her granddaughter's experience at St. Catherine's, her voice never wavered. She told of Kate's ordeal, the promises and the reality, the attempted escape and the threats. When she finished, Garrison objected strenuously, calling it hearsay. I'm recounting what my own granddaughter told me, Martha shot back before the judge could rule. And I'm telling this court that what Father Blackwood did to Kate, he's been doing to girls for years. Grace isn't the first to run. She's just the first brave enough to fight back. The courtroom erupted again. McCall pounded his gavel until order returned. Mr. Bradford, the judge said, you'll need more than one woman's testimony to establish a pattern. What else do you have? Nathan took a breath. This was the moment. Everything hinged on what came next. I have medical evidence, Your Honor, regarding the death of Sister Sarah Fletcher in 1885. The courtroom went deadly silent. Father Blackwood's carefully composed face showed a flicker of genuine alarm. Proceed, Judge McCall said quietly. Doc Margaret Sullivan took the stand. She placed her medical bag on the rail before her and faced the courtroom with the calm authority of someone who dealt in facts, not opinions. 3 days ago, I examined the remains of Sister Sarah Fletcher exhumed from the monastery cemetery. My findings are as follows. She pulled a written report from her bag and read in a clinical voice that made the horror all the more stark. The blunt force trauma, the manual strangulation, the broken bones that came after death, the undeniable conclusion. This woman was murdered. Then her body was thrown from a cliff to disguise the cause of death. The courtroom exploded into chaos. People shouted, gasped, turned to neighbors in shock and disbelief. Father Blackwood shot to his feet, his face white with fury. Objection! This is outrageous. That grave was disturbed illegally. Any evidence obtained must be thrown out. Sit down, Father. Judge McCall's voice cracked like a whip. You'll have your turn. Continue, Doctor. Margaret detailed her findings with scientific precision. When Garrison cross-examined her, trying to cast doubt on her expertise, she stood firm. I stake my medical license on this conclusion, she said. This was murder. No doubt whatsoever. The testimony hung in the air, heavy and damning. Then the door at the back of the courtroom opened. Brother Marcus Webb walked in. Every head turned. Father Blackwood's eyes widened. Nathan exhaled slowly, relief flooding through him. Marcus had come. The monk walked down the center aisle like a man approaching the gallows, each step heavy with the weight of 2 years' silence. When he reached the witness stand, his hand trembled on the Bible. I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, so help me God. And God knows I need help because I've been living in sin for 2 years, carrying a secret that's poisoned my soul. Judge McCall leaned forward. Brother Marcus, do you understand that anything you say here can be used against you in criminal proceedings? I understand, Your Honor. I'm prepared to face whatever consequences come. I just can't carry this anymore. Can't let another woman suffer because I was too afraid to speak. Nathan stood. Tell us what happened to Sister Sarah Fletcher. Marcus's confession came in a flood. The night Sarah tried to leave. Father Blackwood's rage. The brass candlestick. The strike from behind. The order to help dispose of the body. The threats that kept Marcus silent for 2 years. I should have spoken then, Marcus said, tears streaming down his face. Maybe if I had, Grace wouldn't have suffered. Maybe others would have been spared. I'm sorry. God forgive me. I'm so sorry. When he finished, the silence in the courtroom was absolute. Then Judge McCall spoke, his voice carrying the weight of judgment. Sheriff Hayes, take Father Edmund Blackwood into custody. The charge is murder. And the rest happened quickly. Blackwood's arrest. The judge's ruling that the contract was void and the marriage valid. The order to close St. Catherine's and investigate its financial records. The promise of a full murder trial to come. Grace collapsed into Nathan's arms as the courtroom erupted in applause. It was over. She was free. Outside in the winter sunlight, people congratulated them. Doc Margaret smiled her satisfied smile. Samuel whooped with joy. Even Sheriff Hayes approached to apologize for his role in looking the other way. But as they prepared to leave, Deputy Frank Miller pulled Nathan aside. There's something you should know, he said quietly. Blackwood bribed a guard 2 weeks ago, tried to arrange an escape plan. We caught it, but the man's dangerous. Even behind bars, he's got reach. You watch yourself. Nathan nodded, his hand instinctively moving to where his Colt usually hung. They had won in court, but he suspected this war was not quite over. The return journey to Thunder Ridge should have felt triumphant. They had won. Grace was free. Father Blackwood sat in a cell awaiting trial for murder. But Nathan could not shake the feeling that something remained unfinished, like a storm gathering just beyond the horizon. Deputy Miller's warning echoed in his mind. Blackwood bribed a guard. The man's dangerous. Even behind bars, he's got reach. At the cabin, they celebrated quietly. Samuel brought out a bottle of whiskey that Nathan had been saving for years, never finding an occasion worthy of opening it. Doc Margaret stayed for dinner, regaling them with stories of how the courtroom had erupted when Marcus made his confession. Thomas Garrett from the general store stopped by with supplies and congratulations. You did something important today, Garrett said as he prepared to leave. You showed that power doesn't always win, that ordinary people can stand up to institutions and come out the other side. Half the town's talking about it, the other half still in shock. After everyone left, Grace and Nathan sat by the fire. The weight of the past 2 weeks seemed to settle on them both. They had been moving so fast, reacting to threats, building their case, surviving. Now in the sudden stillness, they had to confront what came next. What happens now? Grace asked. You mean with us? Yes, we married for protection. I'm protected now. You fulfilled your promise. If you want to annul the marriage, I'd understand. I could go to Portland, find work, start over somewhere. Blackwood's name means nothing. Nathan was silent for a long time, staring into his coffee, as if the dark liquid held answers to questions he had not yet learned to ask. Do you want to annul it? He finally said. Grace considered the question carefully. 2 weeks ago, she would have said yes without hesitation. A marriage of convenience had seemed like another form of contract, another way of belonging to someone rather than to herself, but these past days had shown her something different. No, she said quietly, but I don't want you trapped either. You didn't sign up for a real wife. You offered me shelter and safety, and you've given me that. I don't want you to feel obligated beyond what you promised. Nathan set down his cup. When he looked at her, his eyes held something she had not seen before. Not the careful distance he had maintained, but a tentative openness, like a door left slightly ajar. Grace, when I pulled you from that snow, something in me woke up that I thought was dead. These past 2 weeks, having you here, cooking together, talking, fighting, Blackwood, I feel alive again. Not the way I felt with Rebecca. That's gone, and I've made my peace with it. But something new, something good. He reached over and took her hand. If you want to stay as my real wife, not just a legal arrangement, I'd like that. I can't promise you romance like in the storybooks. I'm too old and too broken for that. But I can promise you partnership respect and whatever parts of my heart I have left to give. Grace moved closer, threading her fingers through his. I think I've been falling in love with you, and it terrified me. After everything Blackwood did, I thought I was broken too, that I'd never feel safe enough to love anyone. But you showed me I'm not broken, just healing, and I want to heal with you. Nathan cupped her face gently with his free hand. So we're doing this for real this time. For real this time. He kissed her, then not with desperate passion, but with tenderness and promise. When they parted, both had tears on their faces. There's one more thing, Grace said, a slight smile touching her lips. Samuel asked me yesterday if this means he can call me Ma. I told him he should ask you first. Nathan's expression softened in a way she had rarely seen. That boy's been like a son to me for 3 years now. If you're willing to be his mother in truth, not just in name, I think it would mean the world to him. I'm willing, more than willing. They sat together in the quiet cabin, the fire burning low, and for the first time since Rebecca's death, Nathan allowed himself to imagine a future that held more than mere survival, a future with Grace, perhaps even someday with children of their own. Outside, the Montana winter continued its ancient dance, but inside, two broken people had found a way to make each other whole. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that felt remarkably like peace. Grace learned ranch work with the same determination she brought to everything. Nathan taught her to ride properly, to shoot accurately, to read the weather signs that meant the difference between life and death in the mountains. She taught him to laugh again, something he had forgotten how to do. Samuel became a constant presence, spending more nights at their cabin than at his own. He and Grace developed an easy rapport, the kind that forms between people who recognize kindred spirits. Both had lost their families young. Both had learned to survive through resilience and adaptability. Both had found in Nathan an anchor in an uncertain world. In late January, Sheriff Miller rode out to the cabin with news. Blackwood's trial is set for March 15th. The territorial prosecutor is building a case. With Marcus's testimony and Doc Margaret's medical evidence, they're confident of a conviction. He'll hang for what he did to Sarah Fletcher. Good, Nathan said simply. There's more. We've been investigating the monastery's financial records. Turns out Blackwood was running a scheme that went far beyond Grace and the others. He was selling the labor of these women to local businesses, pocketing the money and keeping them in debt. We've identified 8 other women held under similar contracts. They're all being released and compensated from the monastery's assets. Grace felt something loosen in her chest. 8 women, 8 lives freed because she had chosen to fight instead of run. There's one other thing, Miller said, his expression growing cautious. The guard Blackwood tried to bribe, he's talking now. Says Blackwood has associates men who owe him favors or fear his reach. The deputy wanted me to warn you to stay vigilant. A cornered animal is dangerous, and Blackwood's about as cornered as they come. Nathan's hand moved instinctively to his rifle. We'll be ready. After Miller left, Nathan went through the cabin with military precision, checking weapons, securing windows, establishing clear fields of fire. Grace watched him work and understood. This was a man who had spent years as an Army scout. He knew how to prepare for violence, even as he hoped it would never come. Do you think he'll try something? She asked. I think a man who's killed once will kill again if he thinks it's his only way out. And Blackwood knows that if he hangs, his name dies with him. Men like that, they'd rather take others down than go alone. February passed. The weather began to shift, the brutal cold of deep winter, giving way to something slightly less lethal. The snow started to melt in patches, revealing brown earth beneath. Spring was still months away, but its promise lived in the lengthening days. Grace discovered she was pregnant in late February. She had suspected for a week, her body telling her in small ways what her mind was slow to accept. When she finally confided in Doc Margaret during one of the doctor's visits, Margaret confirmed it with a smile. About 8 weeks along, I'd say. You're healthy, the baby seems fine. How do you feel about it? Grace's emotions were a tangle she could not quite sort through. Terror because she had no mother to teach her, because childbirth in Montana killed women regularly, because bringing a child into the world felt like an act of faith she was not sure she possessed. but also joy fierce and unexpected because this baby was hers. Not owned by anyone, not part of any contract, just hers and Nathan's. I'm scared, she admitted. That's normal. But Grace, you're the strongest woman I know. You survived 10 years of hell. You can handle childbirth. And you won't be alone. I'll be here. Nathan will be here. We'll get you through this. That evening, Grace told Nathan. They were sitting by the fires, had become their custom coffee in hand, and companionable silence between them. Nathan, I have news. He looked up from the rifle he was cleaning, something in her tone making him set the weapon aside. We're going to have a baby. For a long moment, Nathan simply stared at her. His face went through a series of expressions too quick to catalog. Shock, fear, wonder, grief, hope. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. A baby. You're sure? Doc Margaret confirmed it today. He stood abruptly and walked to the window, his back to her. Grace's heart sank. She had hoped for joy, or at least acceptance. This looked like retreat. Then she saw his shoulders shake and realized he was crying. She went to him, placed a hand on his back. Nathan. He turned, and the tears on his face were not of sorrow, but of something more complex. Loss and hope intertwined. If it's a girl, his voice cracked. Can we name her Emma after my daughter and Rebecca both, honoring the past while building the future? Grace felt her own tears start. And if it's a bourgeois, Thomas, after your father, he was a good man who had a hard life. He deserves to be remembered. She pulled him into an embrace, and they stood together at the window watching the last light fade from the western sky. Two people who had lost everything, who had found each other in the snow, who were now creating something new. A family born not from the absence of pain, but from the choice to build despite it. The pregnancy changed things in subtle ways. Nathan became even more protective, though he tried to hide it. He insisted Grace stop doing the heavier ranch work. She argued he relented, slightly they compromised. She continued to help, but let him take on anything that required significant lifting or climbing. Samuel was overjoyed when they told him. I'm going to be a big brother, he said, wonder in his voice. Then more cautiously, or I guess like an uncle, what do I call this? You call yourself whatever feels right, Grace said. There are no rules for families like ours. March arrived, bringing with it longer days and the first hints of warmth. The trial date approached. Father Blackwood remained in the Cedar Ridge jail, held without bail, given the severity of the charges in his previous escape attempt. But Nathan could not shake the feeling that something was coming. It came on March 10th, 5 days before the trial. Nathan was checking the trap line in the early morning when he heard Ash begin barking frantically at the cabin. The sound was different from the dog's usual alerts, more urgent, more afraid. Nathan's blood went cold. He abandoned the traps and ran. He was still 200 yards from the cabin when he heard the shot. The sound of a pistol firing echoed across the valley, sharp and final. Nathan's mind went to terrible places. Grace, the baby, Samuel who had stayed the night. He ran faster than a man his age should be able to, Winchester in hand, every second an eternity. He burst through the cabin door to find Grace standing with his greener shotgun in her hands, the weapon still smoking. Samuel was pressed against the far wall, eyes wide, and on the floor, bleeding from a shoulder wound, lay Father Edmund Blackwood. He broke in, Grace said, her voice remarkably steady despite the tremor in her hands. Samuel was outside getting firewood. I heard the window break. He came through with a pistol. Said if he was going to hang, he'd make sure I went first. Nathan's eyes went to Blackwood, taking in the scene with a scout's trained observation. The broken window, the pistol on the floor dropped when the shotgun blast hit, the blood spreading across Blackwood's shoulder and chest. Not immediately fatal, but close. He's still alive, Nathan said. He moved to Grace, gently took the shotgun from her hands. You did good. You protected yourself and the baby. The baby, Blackwood gasped from the floor, his face twisted in pain and hatred. Of course, the whore got herself pregnant. How fitting. Nathan's jaw tightened, but he did not rise to the bait. Instead, he knelt and checked Blackwood's wound. Bad but survivable if they got him to a doctor soon. Samuel, ride to town. Get Sheriff Miller and Doc Margaret. Fast as you can. The boy nodded and bolted. Nathan stood over Blackwood, rifle ready, watching the man who had caused so much suffering now reduced to bleeding on a cabin floor. "How did you escape?" Grace asked, finding her voice. Blackwood laughed, a wet, painful sound. "Money opens many locks. I paid the guard double what I offered before. Took his keys, his gun, walked right out. Thought I'd solve my problem before it solved me. By killing Grace, by removing the witness, Marcus can recant. Say he was coerced, confused. The body could be explained away. But her," he looked at Grace with pure malice. "She knows too much. She's the linchpin. Remove her and the case falls apart." "Except now you've added attempted murder to the charges," Nathan said. "Except I won't live to stand trial." Blackwood's breathing was getting shallower, his face paler. "That shotgun did more damage than it looks. I can feel it. Internal bleeding. I've got maybe an hour." He was right. Nathan had seen enough battlefield wounds to recognize a mortal injury. The buckshot had caught him in the shoulder and chest, likely perforating a lung and maybe the subclavian artery. Without immediate surgery, which was hours away, Blackwood would bleed out internally. "Good," Grace said coldly. "You deserve worse for what you did to Sarah, to Kate, to all of us. I saved you." Blackwood's voice was fading, but the venom remained. "I gave you food, shelter, purpose. You were nothing when you came to me, a drunk's daughter with no prospects. I made you useful. You made me a slave. I made you what you were always meant to be. Property." He coughed, blood flecking his lips. "That's all women are in the end. Property of fathers, husbands, or the church. I just understood the system better than most." Nathan had heard enough. "Grace, go outside. You don't need to hear this." But Grace shook her head. "No, I stayed silent for 10 years. I'm not leaving now. I want to watch him face judgment." They waited. Blackwood's breathing grew more labored. His skin took on a waxy quality. After 20 minutes, he spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. "Do you know what the real joke is? I was going to let you go. After the trial, after they convicted me, I'd already arranged for the monastery's assets to be distributed. You and the others would have gotten your share. I was done. Finished. But I couldn't let it end with me behind bars, humiliated, exposed. Better to go out fighting." "You could have chosen different," Nathan said. "You could have admitted your crimes, made restitution, spent your last days seeking forgiveness. Instead, you chose this. Forgiveness is for the weak. I regret nothing." Blackwood's eyes were glazing over death, approaching fast. "Except that I failed. That this whore gets to live while I die. That's my only regret." Those were his last words. Father Edmund Blackwood died on the floor of Nathan Bradford's cabin at 10:15 in the morning on March 10, 1888. He was 46 years old, and he died as he had lived, full of hatred and refusing grace to the very end. Sheriff Miller arrived an hour later with Doc Margaret and a deputy. They took statements, examined the scene, and ruled it a clear case of self-defense. Blackwood had escaped custody, broken into a private home, and attempted murder. Grace had defended herself lawfully. "There'll be an inquest," Miller said, "but it's a formality. No jury in Montana would convict a pregnant woman for shooting an intruder." "You're clear, Mrs. Bradford." After they took the body away, Nathan and Grace sat together on the porch. The morning's violence seemed unreal, like something that had happened to other people in another life. "I killed a man," Grace said quietly. "You stopped a man who was trying to kill you. There's a difference. Does it feel different? In your heart, does it feel different?" Nathan considered the question. He had killed men during the war, during his years scouting hostile territory. He understood the weight of taking a life, even a life that desperately needed taking. "Sometimes," he said, "sometimes it feels like justice. Sometimes it feels like murder, even when it's not. The feeling doesn't always match the reality. You did what you had to do. The nightmares might come anyway. If they do, we'll face them together." Grace leaned against him. "I'm not sorry he's dead. Is that wrong?" "No, it's honest." They sat in silence, watching the snow melt in the March sun. The ordeal was truly over now. Blackwood was dead. The monastery was closed. The women were free. Justice, imperfect and bloodstained, had been served. 2 months later, on a warm day in May, Grace and Nathan stood on the hillside behind their cabin. They were planting flowers around the graves of Rebecca and the first Emma. White roses, Grace's favorite. Do you think they'd approve? Grace asked, her hand resting on her swelling belly. Of me, of us, of the baby. Nathan knelt and pressed his palm against the earth where his first family lay. Rebecca always said I had too much heart to waste it on loneliness. I think she'd tell me I waited too long to figure that out. And Emma, she loved everyone. She'd have loved you too. They planted the roses in silence, adding beauty to a place of sorrow. When they finished, Nathan helped Grace to her feet. She was 5 months along now, her pregnancy obvious and healthy. Doc Margaret said everything looked good. As they walked back to the cabin, Samuel met them halfway carrying a letter. This just came from Portland. Grace opened it. The letter was from Kate Brennan, Martha's granddaughter. Dear Grace, it read, my grandmother wrote to me about the trial and about Father Blackwood's death. I wish I could say I'm sorry he's gone, but I'm not. I'm only sorry he didn't suffer more. Thank you for being brave enough to fight when I was only brave enough to run. Thank you for making sure his evil died with him. My husband and I are expecting our first child in September. I'm naming her Sarah after the sister we couldn't save. May our daughters grow up in a world where men like Blackwood are the exception, not the rule. With love and gratitude, Kate. Grace folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her pocket. Another connection, another thread in the web of women who had strived and were now building lives on their own terms. Summer came, and with it the hardest work of the ranch year. Hay to cut fences, to mend cattle, to manage. Grace worked as much as her pregnancy allowed, then took on lighter tasks as her belly grew. She cooked, she mended, she kept the household running while Nathan and Samuel handled the heavier labor. In late June, they received word that 8 women from the monastery had sued the church for reparations. The case would drag on for years, but early rulings suggested they would win. The precedent Grace's case had set was changing Montana law, making debt bondage harder to hide behind religious justification. July brought heat and long days. Grace grew uncomfortable, her body preparing for the child that would arrive in late summer. Nathan fussed over her, trying not to show his worry. She tolerated his concern with good humor, understanding that his fear came from love and loss intertwined. On August 15, 1888, Grace went into labor. It started in the afternoon with mild cramps, she initially dismissed as false labor. By evening, they had intensified into something undeniable. Nathan sent Samuel riding for Doc Margaret while he stayed with Grace, holding her hand, trying to remember everything he had learned about childbirth from distant memories of Emma's birth. Margaret arrived as the sun set, assessed the situation, and settled in for what she predicted would be a long night. She was right. The labor continued through darkness and into the next day. 14 hours of pain and effort and fear. Nathan stayed by Grace's side the entire time, offering water, encouragement, his presence. Samuel waited outside, keeping the fire going, preparing food no one would eat. At 10:30 on the morning of August 16th, Emma Grace Bradford entered the world. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, with dark hair and lungs that announced her arrival to all of Thunder Ridge. Doc Margaret placed the baby in Grace's arms, and Nathan looked down at his daughter with tears streaming into his beard. The grief and joy of it nearly broke him. Another Emma, a second chance he had never thought to receive. Hello, little one, Grace whispered, exhausted but radiant. Welcome home. Nathan touched the baby's tiny hand, and she gripped his finger with surprising strength. She's perfect. She's ours, Grace corrected, and that makes her more than perfect. The years that followed brought changes to Thunder Ridge and to the Bradford family. In 1890, Samuel married Sarah Garrett, daughter of Thomas the store owner. The young couple built a cabin a mile south of Nathan and Grace's place, close enough to help with the ranch, but far enough to have their own space. In 1892, Grace gave birth to a son, Thomas Nathan Bradford. He came easier than Emma, faster, as if he knew he was arriving into a world ready to receive him. In 1895, a third child arrived, a daughter they named Margaret after Doc Margaret, who had become not just their doctor, but their friend and the children's godmother. The ranch prospered. What had been a hermit's survival operation became a thriving family business. 200 acres, cattle and horses, enough income to hire help during the busy seasons. Nathan proved to be a good teacher, training ranch hands in the skills he had learned over decades. Grace wrote, she started with letters to other survivors of places like St. Catherine's, offering advice and solidarity. Then she began writing articles for territorial newspapers about workers' rights and the exploitation of vulnerable people. In 1905, at the age of 45, she published a memoir, From Chains to Freedom, One Woman's Journey. It became a regional bestseller and was cited in legal cases across the West. Montana achieved statehood in 1889, and with it came new laws. Debt bondage was explicitly outlawed. Contracts signed by minors without parental consent were unenforceable. Religious organizations came under increased scrutiny. Grace's case was cited in the legislative debates. Her story mattered beyond just herself. Samuel and Sarah had 4 children. Emma married a schoolteacher and moved to Helena, where she became involved in the women's suffrage movement. Thomas took over the ranch when Nathan grew too old to handle the daily work. Margaret became a nurse trained in Denver and returned to Montana to serve communities that desperately needed medical care. The years were not without sorrow. In 1913, Doc Margaret died peacefully in her sleep at 77. The entire county attended her funeral. 2 years later, Martha Brennan followed, having lived to see her granddaughter safe and the monastery that had harmed her destroyed. But there was joy too. Grandchildren arrived then, great-grandchildren. The hillside behind the cabin became a family cemetery carefully tended with flowers planted each spring. Rebecca and the first Emma rested there no longer alone. Nathan and Grace would join them in time, but not yet. Not while there was still work to do. On Christmas Day, 1920, Nathan Bradford died in his sleep at the age of 82. He went peacefully. Grace holding his hand surrounded by 3 children, 8 grandchildren, and a lifetime of memories that proved redemption was possible even after the worst loss. His last words to Grace were simple. Best thing I ever did was not let go that night. You gave me 33 years I never thought I'd have. Thank you for choosing me. The funeral drew hundreds. The hermit who had retreated from the world had, through choosing to save one woman, reconnected with it in ways that rippled outward across generations. Sheriff Miller, old and retired, gave the eulogy. Nathan Bradford was the finest man I knew. He stood for justice when it was easier to look away. He saved lives, built a family, and left a legacy that will endure long after we're all dust. Montana is better because he lived in it. Grace continued for another 15 years. She wrote, she advocated, she testified before the state legislature about workers' rights. In 1933, Montana passed the Hartley-Bradford Act protecting vulnerable people from exploitation under the guise of charity. Grace attended the signing ceremony at 73, frail but fierce. She died on April 15, 1935, in the cabin where Nathan had saved her 48 years earlier. Her children and grandchildren surrounded her bed. Her last words were to her namesake granddaughter, young Emma. Never let anyone tell you who you are. You decide that yourself. And once you decide, fight for it with everything you have. Your great-grandfather taught me that. I'm teaching you. Pass it on. They buried her beside Nathan on the hillside. 5 graves now, 5 pine trees, 5 lives that mattered, that intertwined, that changed the course of countless others. Thunder Ridge Ranch, Montana. Christmas Eve, 1955. Samuel Bradford finished his story as the fire burned low in the hearth. His grandson William sat transfixed, eyes shining with unshed tears. So they lived happily ever after, the boy asked. They lived, Samuel corrected gently. Some years were happy, some were hard. They had 2 more children after Emma, your grandmother. They worked this ranch together for 32 years until my foster father passed in 1920. My foster mother followed him 15 years later. They're buried on the hill behind us beside Rebecca and the first Emma. William processed this, his young mind working through the timeline. Wait, if you're 83 now and you were 15 when you met Grace, that means you're Samuel from the story. The old man smiled. Took you long enough to figure that out, boy. You were there for everything. You saw it all. The escape, the trial, the shooting. I was there. Your great-grandfather, Nathan, saved my life too. Took me in, taught me to be a man, gave me a home when I had nothing. That's why I took the Bradford name. That's why this ranch is mine to pass down to you. William was quiet for a moment, absorbing the weight of family history. And the lesson, Grandpa, what am I supposed to learn from this? Samuel leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped together. That courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right despite the fear. Your great-grandfather was terrified that night he found Grace. Terrified of failing again, of losing someone, of opening his heart to pain. But he chose to try anyway. That's bravery. I'm scared about joining the army, William admitted. What if I'm not brave enough? You're a Bradford. Bravery is in your blood. But more than that, you get to choose it, same as Nathan chose it, same as Grace chose it. When you face hard decisions, and you will remember this story, remember that one person's choice to act with courage can change everything. Samuel stood stiffly, his joints protesting 83 years of hard use. He walked to the window and looked out at the mountains, the same mountains Nathan had looked at 68 years before. Out there under that snow is where it all started, where your great-grandfather pulled a dying woman from a blizzard and decided her life mattered more than his comfort. That choice led to everything. To this ranch, to this family, to you. William joined him at the window. It's beautiful. Yes, and every snowflake reminds me that even in the darkest cold, even in the deepest winter, miracles can happen. If you're brave enough to reach for them and strong enough to hold on when you do. Outside, snow continued to fall on Thunder Ridge, covering the land in silent white. Inside, the fire crackled low, casting warm light on the walls lined with family photographs. Pictures of Nathan with his thick beard and steady eyes, Grace with her gentle smile and steel spine, Samuel and Sarah on their wedding day, the children, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren. A family tree with roots sunk deep in Montana soil branches, reaching toward a future shaped by choices made on a Christmas Eve long ago. "Merry Christmas, Grandpa," William said. "Merry Christmas, boy." Samuel put his arm around his grandson's shoulders. "And Merry Christmas to Nathan and Grace wherever they are. I hope they know their story still matters, that their courage still inspires, that their love still lives." The old man and the boy stood together at the window, watching the snow fall on the mountains that had witnessed everything. On the hillside behind the cabin, 5 pine trees stood sentinel over 5 graves. The wind moved through their branches, a sound like whispered stories passing from one generation to the next. Tomorrow, William would begin preparing for the army. He would face his own tests, make his own choices, build his own story. But tonight he had learned something essential. That ordinary people could do extraordinary things. That broken hearts could heal. That justice was worth fighting for. That families were built not just by blood, but by choice. And that sometimes on a Christmas Eve in Montana, a man might hear a question about miracles and find himself telling a story about the greatest miracle of all. The choice to save a stranger, and in doing so to save yourself. The fire burned down to embers. The snow continued to fall. And in a small cabin on Thunder Ridge, the story lived on, passed from grandfather to grandson, a legacy more valuable than land or gold. A legacy of courage, redemption, and love that endured beyond death, beyond time, beyond the winter's cold embrace. This was the gift Nathan and Grace Bradford gave to the world. Not wealth or fame, but proof that one person's choice to act with courage could ripple outward across generations, changing lives, changing laws, changing the very shape of justice. And in 1955, on a snowy Christmas Eve, that gift was given again as an old man named Samuel told a young boy named William about the night everything changed and taught him that the power to change the world lived not in mighty institutions or powerful men, but in ordinary people who chose against all odds and in the face of all fear to do what was right. The story ended. The fire died to ash. The snow fell silent on the mountains. But the legacy continued as it always would, as long as someone remained to remember to tell and to believe that courage, once chosen, never truly dies. It lives on in the hearts of those brave enough to reach for it. And that Samuel Bradford knew was the real miracle. Not the rescue in the snow, though that mattered. Not the victory in court, though that changed laws. But the simple, stubborn insistence that people mattered more than power, that justice was worth fighting for, and that love, even love born from tragedy and loss, could build something beautiful and enduring. Outside, the Montana night embraced Thunder Ridge in its ancient arms. Inside, a grandfather and grandson stood together, connected by blood and story, to a man and woman who had lived and loved and fought and won, and whose choice on a Christmas Eve in 1887 had made all the difference. The story was told, the lesson was given, and in the silence that followed, William Bradford understood what his grandfather had known all along. That he was not just heir to a ranch, but to a legacy of courage that no amount of money could buy and no passage of time could erase. He would join the army. He would face his fears. He would make his own choices and build his own story. But he would do it knowing that he came from people who had stood when it was easier to run, who had fought when it was safer to surrender, who had loved when it was less painful to remain alone. And that knowledge, that legacy, that story would carry him through whatever came next, just as it had carried them all.